Welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryant, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Thank you for joining us. First, let me wish everyone who is celebrating a happy Hanukkah, although happy is probably not the first word that comes to mind this week. But Hanukkah is about who we are as Jewish people and what we've been willing to do to preserve that. The preservation of the Jewish state is clearly on everybody's mind since October 7th. But there is a second set of threats to Jewish peoplehood and as Americans, as well as Jews, as well as supporters of Israel. I think we're beginning to understand the domestic threat. Watching what's going on city streets and on college campuses, the always tenuous distinction between anti-Israelism or anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has for many of us been wiped out. Now, the precursor to the post-October 7th tidal wave is our topic of discussion today with David Bernstein. David is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm going to bring him on in a minute. But before we talk to David, let me give you your JPC commercial and set the stage. We were founded in 1985 as a nonprofit organization providing analysis of foreign and domestic policy by scholars, academics, and commentators. We support strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Right now, however, our most important job is to support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. I had an opportunity this week to go to a great pro-Israel dinner, a really great dinner. It was Emet, and it was terrific. But a lot of our friends, including our Jewish friends, kept talking about Israel's right to exist. I put that in quotes. I put it in quotes mostly so I won't use my hands to tear my hair out, because it isn't some ephemeral right to exist that we support. It is recognition of Israel's legitimacy and permanence, and its right to secure and recognize boundaries free from threats or acts of force. Those are the words of UN Resolution 242, 1967, and they are the resonant words today. Secure and recognize boundaries free from threats or acts of force. At the same time, we also support the efforts of the government of Israel and the IDF to defend the people of Israel and to bring the perpetrators of the massacres, hostage-taking, rapes, and rocket barrages to justice. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, see our quarterly magazine In Focus, and you can find our previous webinar programming. Now, as pretty much all of you are aware, this webinar series does not deal with the battlefield. It doesn't deal with the day-to-day operations of the IDF. We concentrate more on the context in which the war is being fought. But if you want something closer to battlefield news, check us out on Twitter or on what's it called, X, previously known as Twitter. We are at the JPC, and we have a lot of breaking news from Israel and from elsewhere, and you can help us boost our numbers. So that's at the JPC on X. And now David Bernstein, our guest, a passionate advocate of the free expression of ideas and the state of Israel. David Bernstein is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which opposes illiberal ideologies and supports true liberal values in and outside the Jewish community. David is the author of Woke Antisemitism: How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. He is past president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the former executive director of the David Project. He spent 13 years with the American Jewish Committee in senior positions, and he is today a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, known as ISGAP, and a strategic advisor for the Combat Antisemitism movement. He is a prolific speaker, podcaster, and writer, having written hundreds of opinion pieces in the Jewish and the general press. David, we are really pleased to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful to be with you.
I would like to start you with a broad question. We Jews and we Americans had something of an awakening after October 7th. You did not, on the other hand. You knew that this was wrapped into our colleges and universities and parts of our society. What did we miss? Give us the background. What were we not seeing?
Yeah, so I always start out by saying, well, 31 student groups at Harvard signed a statement that blames Israel for the massacre that Hamas committed against Israeli citizens. Did that just come from nowhere? And of course that's a rhetorical question, because of course it didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere, and it didn't just come from sort of the pervasiveness of anti-Zionism. It has much deeper well springs in our recent academic tradition, and it has been brewing for a while, not just in the academy, although it started in the academy, but it sort of escaped the lab into the larger society. So we've been seeing this in corporations, and we've been seeing it in the arts, and we've been seeing it in poetry societies and in youth fiction and all walks of institutional life. We've been seeing this ideology, and that ideology, simply put, divides the world into oppressors and oppressed, and labels any community or group of people who have succeeded on average as being part of the oppressor class. So you can see how Jews are immediately implicated, and you can see how a perceived successful country like Israel is immediately implicated in this ideology. So where did it come from? Well, in the late 1960s, two trends were happening at the same time that really infected our universities. First was in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, when they created a new field called Zionology. The writer and scholar Isabella Tabarovsky writes about this. She's from the former Soviet Union herself, writes about how they wrote books and articles on Zionism to discredit it in the eyes of the Jewish community and to discredit Israel in the eyes of their allies. And that was extremely effective. If there's any remnant of the former Soviet Union, it might be in its anti-Zionism. And you could see just years later, in the mid-1970s, of course, you had the Zionism is Racism resolution that passed the UN General Assembly. So that's been in the bloodstream of society and eventually became a centerpiece of post-colonial ideology. But before we get there, around that same time, in the late 1960s, there was an academic movement known as postmodernism. Now, what is postmodernism? And this all sounds very esoteric. And normally people like us might be sort of, rolling our eyes when we hear these terms like that. But you can't ignore it, because it's actually infected the way people think today. It's what's happening in our universities. So just bear with me for a second. Postmodernism is this idea that knowledge is not something that one gets through scientific inquiry or one gets through debate. That's what we mean by liberalism in the classical sense, is that we can know the truth by engaging in a free expression of ideas, by engaging in scientific inquiry. But postmodernism came along and said, there is no truth. What we consider knowledge has been really established by powerful actors in society who embed what they want people to think is true into the very social discourses of societies, the way we talk about things, so that we'll just reinforce their power. So everything that we consider science is really just an effort by powerful actors to instill their advantages into the system. And so what postmodernists set about to do was to tear down everything that we think is true. That's what they did in the academy, and that's what early postmodernism did. But in the late 1960s and the 70s, it started to take a much more political activist turn. So then you had the Palestinian American literary critic Edward Said at Columbia University. I'm sure many of you heard his name. He wrote a book called Orientalism that is perhaps one of the most influential books of our time. And what it did is it made it almost impossible to criticize the cultures of the Middle East and other societies that were former colonies. He is the father of what's called post-colonialism or post-colonial ideology. The idea is that even today, the colonial powers, the global north, as they're often called, continue to oppress the global south. And global south, of course, includes the Arab world and Palestinians and the like. So when you take Soviet anti-Zionism and you combine it with post-colonialism, and then you throw into the mix Qatari money, or formerly it used to be Saudi money. Now today it's mostly Qatari money, who are funding these programs, these university programs that are hostile to American values and American interests. you have almost the perfect storm. So when you ask the question, why did 31 student groups at Harvard sign a statement that blamed Israelis for the massacre that Hamas committed against their citizens? There you have it. You have 50 or more years of ideological insanity in our universities that have produced this current moment. You're muted, Shoshana.
Sorry. So it goes even farther back than I had thought it went. I mean, it goes all the way back. And we have someone who just asked a question, actually two questions. First, does it go back to, or does it have any roots in the American draft avoidance process, where a lot of people were very unhappy with the United States, in part because they didn't want to go to Vietnam, they didn't want to be drafted, but in part because they didn't like the fact that we were fighting in that country, sort of a north-south thing, a big white country and a small Asian country. Do you see any roots back in there? Is one question. The second question is funding for this. Money, where's the money coming from? It's got to be money.
Yeah. So look, this has its roots in the 1960s more broadly, right? So you could say it's in draft avoidance, it's in the ferment of the 1960s and this major transition that was taking place in our society, where people became fundamentally dissatisfied with the status quo. And so it's easier to understand in that moment why some university presidents caved into a group of radical students that demanded that they suspend the normal categories of scholarly inquiry and allow ethnic studies programs to be established in places like San Francisco State University, that then spread to over 1,300 colleges in a matter of just a few years. So this was a very rapid shift, and it happened and during the 60s, at a time where people were profoundly dissatisfied with society and the direction it was going, in the turmoil and tumult of the 60s. Where is it being financed? I mean, I already alluded to Qatar. Qatar is one of the most significant financiers of some of these radical departments. They come from, they provided in excess of $5 billion in the last decade or so to American universities, an astronomical amount. And they've seeded significant funding in places like Texas A&M and Cornell and the like. There's some very specific universities that they put front and center in their financing, but it's spread pretty well. And so I think Qatar is one of the major funders. A lot of this is homegrown ideology, and I think we have to understand that even if Qatar wasn't funding this, we would still have a lot of the same problems. They've made it worse, but some of this is just being funded by the universities themselves, by ideologues who have gone up the ranks in the humanities departments, who are now committed to this ideological agenda.
I've actually always believed that you could insert foreign money, and there are issues also with Chinese money, for example.
Sure.
But a lot of what we do and what we think, we bring on ourselves. And
Absolutely.
we've been fairly effective. A Gallup poll at the end of November showed that 67% of Americans under 35 oppose Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. It's a huge number.
Yes.
I don't believe they all quite understand what Israel's doing in the Gaza Strip, but nevertheless, there is a broad sense that younger Americans do not approve of what Israel's doing. So can we fix this? Is that an insurmountable number?
I mean, it's a daunting number for sure. Can we fix it? Look, what choice do we have? You know, there are a lot of pessimistic Jews and friends that I come across who say, this is just not fixable. Let's go do something else. And I think, well, what are we going to do? I mean, we have a stake in this wonderful society of America. And it's not just an assault on Jews, and it's not just an assault on Zionism, and it's not just assault on Israel. It is assault on American values and what it means to be American. And what choice do we have but to stick up for those values, to stick up for a society that values the free expression of ideas? That's who we Americans are. So how can we not fight that fight and think that we can win it? And if we don't go into this thinking that we can win it, then we won't win it. So I start there. And I think that there are several things that we can do to turn the tables here. The number one thing is we've got to figure out what to do about these university departments and programs and so forth. It's an uphill battle, but it's one I think over time, if we're not trying to fix it in the next 6 months, because we're not, but over the next 6 years and 16 years, we have a fighting chance. One of the things I would do is we've got to deal with these diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, these sprawling bureaucracies that have indoctrinated young people to think in this oppressor versus oppressed framework. If we can't put those aside, or we can't change them in a fundamental sense, I think we're going to be stuck with a lot of this ideology in colleges. There are different schools of thought on this. There are some Jews who want to get anti-Semitism taught in these along with the suite of other forms of oppression, so that anti-Semitism is taught in the same way or thought of in the same way as racism or Islamophobia and the like. I think that that's a losing battle for us. I mean, it's easy to understand why that's the great temptation of the Jews is to do exactly that. But what we're doing is we're reinforcing the very ideological terms that ultimately lead us to be labeled as the oppressor. And I think it's ultimately a strategic mistake to do that. Now, there are some DEI programs that I've seen that are less extreme, less ideological, less problematic. And I don't mind us engaging those, but I think they're few and far between. And most of them are quite crazy.
Do you have an example of a good one or a decent one?
Yeah, I've seen corporate DEI programs, and I'm not going to name the places, where all they do is bring speakers in once a month, and there's no DEI trainer who's coming in telling everybody what they must think. They'll bring in a book author one month that might give a problematic perspective, but the next month they could bring me in to speak on anti-Semitism. So why would I not speak to that group? Because it's not part of a larger coherent ideological program. And to me, that's fine. That's not what we're getting in most places. There are even some approaches like Chloe Valdry's theory of enchantment. It's a diversity company that she has that I think is quite open and liberal and is just trying to get people to care about each other. And we should care about each other. So there's nothing wrong with caring about each other. And being more empathetic and the like. That's fine. That's not ideological. But a lot of these are really ideological. We have some hard data on it. The Heritage Foundation did a study of the Twitter feeds of several of DEI directors at various campuses around the country, and found an extraordinary number of them were engaged in sort of anti-Israel Twitter. In fact, many more of them had tweeted negatively about Israel, and this is way before October 7th. This is about 2 years ago. Than they had China. So they had more favorable views about China than they did Israel, which tells you about their ideological orientation. And there are numerous examples of where DEI directors have been outright hostile on college campuses. So I think we know we have a big problem on our hand, and I think we either have to end it, as Barry Weiss suggested in Tablet Magazine a couple of weeks ago, or we've got to transform it, as David Brooks argued in his piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Either end or transform it, but we cannot just continue to engage it. A second thing we need to do, I think, is we've got to start creating academic programs that are competitive with these horrible studies programs that exist across campus, ethnic studies and the like. These are the vectors of transmission of this ideology in its most extreme form, that teach decolonialism and settler colonialism, inevitably characterize America as a settler colonial state, and Canada as a settler colonial state, and of course Israel as a settler colonial state, and therefore illegitimate states. And because of the outsized role that Zionism has played in the collective leftist imagination, it tends to focus more on Zionism and antipathy towards Zionism than any other form of settler colonialism. So even on that score, we fare worse than everybody else. Not just, maybe if Israel was just treated like Canada, we'd be okay, but it's not. It's the focus of these people. So I think what we need are these alternative academic programs that are based on free inquiry. Yale Law School, for example, has just established, it's not even up and running yet, some kind of center for free inquiry. I don't know exactly what they're going to call it. And I know that these are in the works in other universities. So if I were a billionaire, and I'm not, I would suggest that they move their money from sort of the general funded universities and start establishing these centers for free inquiry, which all universities should be anyway, but they're not. And that those great programs attract some of the top talent in academia, people who are genuinely devoted to the free exchange of ideas, critical thought, and the like. And I think that they'll also attract the best students. And I think over time, they'll outcompete these ridiculous ethnic studies programs and the like on college campuses, and that we can start to restore some semblance of normalcy. And the third thing I think we need to do is stop the foreign funding of universities, particularly Qatari funding. I think obviously there's a lot of awareness of this right now. The U.S. administration has been deeply engaged with the Qataris over Iran, unfortunately, but also in the current hostage situation. The Israeli government, to be honest with you, has been very engaged with Qatar as well. So, they haven't exactly been a force for change in American policy on this either. So I think that's got to end. I think that Qatar has to be pressured. The U.S. government has to start to turn up the heat on Qatar and get them to end funding for these nefarious programs at universities.
So we had several people jump in with questions because you mentioned Qatar, and nobody really thinks about Qatar. I mean, it's 7 feet square, and yes, it's got a lot of money, but it's really not. But isn't Qatar just the avatar for Iran? I mean, we're really talking about the inculcation of Iranian interests. What Qatar is the ATM for Iran. It takes the money, it distributes the money for Iran in both directions. So do we really have, somebody said, what's wrong with Qatar? Why don't we like Qatar? I think our problem is bigger. I think our problem is that we really have an argument with Iran, and you're seeing that play in college campuses behind Qatari money.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I think Qatari interests align with Iranian interests for sure. But Qatar is Muslim Brotherhood. It's Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran is a Shia country. That doesn't mean that their interests aren't aligned. I think that they are. Unlike other Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, which see themselves as mortal enemies of Iran and are therefore embracing Israel as one counterbalance to the great Shia threat, the Qataris have sort of made peace with the idea that their interests align with Iran, and they have a typical Muslim Brotherhood agenda. And that is to fund these Middle East studies programs that portray Zionism as illegitimate and blame the entire condition of the Middle East on the West and Israel and the like. Does that align with Iran? Yes. Do I think they're doing the bidding of Qatar or Iran? I think they're probably doing their own bidding. I mean, I think these are ideological forces. They don't need Iran in the sense that they have their own money. I mean, Qatar is like a corporation run by 300,000 people. I think there's something like 3 million or so people living in Qatar. It's a small country, but only like 1/10 of them, and I'm butchering the numbers to a degree, but you'll get the scope of this. Only 1/10 of them, about 300,000, are actually Qataris. And they are a Muslim Brotherhood state that is pushing an agenda. And the question is, will they, like Saudi Arabia, back off from it? Saudi Arabia was doing all this. If we had this conversation 20 years ago, we would have been talking about Saudi Arabia, not Qatar. But because Saudi Arabia came under such tremendous scrutiny, and because they themselves decided to back off from some of these previous commitments, they changed. So there's a reason to believe we could do the same with Qatar.
So it's also true, UAE spent 10 years getting rid of radical Islam inside UAE, and they've come out the other end and have decided to do sort of constructive things. It's probably worth saying that Hamas is Sunni Muslim Brotherhood also, which is why Egypt won't talk to them. So Qatar, you're saying, follows its own determination of what's in Qatar's interest. If it aligns with Iran, it aligns with Iran. And occasionally it aligns with Israel. And these, as you say, the Israelis talk to them as well. So you see it less as a face for Iran than actual Qatari interests being manifested.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
But it's bad either way. It's bad both ways.
Well, you can make the case then that Hamas being Muslim Brotherhood, if Qatar is actually a Muslim Brotherhood country, there's reason then to put it on the terrorism list and remove its money, excuse me, from the universities. So either way you say it, I suppose Qatar really should be told to face up to what it's done. And I'm not sure that the administration, this one or any other one, is interested in doing that. But
they've actually been elevated. They've been given a kind of most favored nation status recently for the intermediary role they play with Iran, which I think is highly problematic. I understand, look, right now when there's hostages, Qatar might have a role to play in all that, and probably the US and Israel are reluctant to do that. But I think in the long run, we're going to have to face the music here. They're going to have to face the music.
Minimally, they should lose their major non-NATO ally status, I suppose.
Tomorrow.
Right. Yesterday? Yeah, tomorrow.
Yesterday.
So, okay, so we've tended to focus, the American people in general, and you and I for the last 20 minutes, on things like Harvard and Cornell and where the big money goes and all that. But most college students don't go to Harvard. They
Right.
don't go to Cornell. They go to state universities. The vast majority of kids that are going at a different level. How do you see those colleges? Are we looking at a narrow slice into which people have put a lot of money and you end up getting a certain ideology? Or is this broadly across the colleges? Because if it's state universities, there is leverage to be had with state legislators who fund them.
Yeah. So I think it's everywhere, but the ideology is more prevalent in certain campuses, particularly those elite universities that you mentioned and others. But that doesn't mean it hasn't infected state colleges. It clearly has, and we're seeing plenty of evidence. Again, there are places where it's less of a problem, but still a problem, and there are places where it's more of a problem. The California state universities, as you can imagine, are highly problematic. The East Coast state universities are highly problematic, and a lot of those in the Midwest and the South might be less problematic, depending on where you are, but it's everywhere. I mean, an ethnic studies program, my alma mater, Ohio State, can be as bad as it could be at Berkeley. The DEI program, there was some recent research done by the National Association of Scholars on this. At Ohio State, again, a school whose football team I root for, it is just as bad and toxic as the DEI program at Berkeley or Columbia. So I think it's pretty spread. The other places that really get hit by are the small liberal art colleges. I spoke to a professor, I don't think wants to be named, but let's say it's a Northwest liberal arts college, who is a Russian Jewish professor, who said that the situation in his school is just all encompassing. Like he hears these protests every single day from his office. He himself has been subject to a cancellation campaign because he supports Israel. Other professors have sort of isolated him, so he feels this in a very acute way. So you have those schools, which in many sense are probably worse than the Ivies are. But again, I don't think that our kids get that much added benefit in the state universities, depending on where they are. There are more than 4,000 colleges in this country. So, I'm sure there's a lot of community colleges and engineering colleges and the like where this is less prevalent. But, is MIT any better than Columbia? Probably not, maybe even worse because of its leadership.
MIT is actually not very good at all. So someone has asked us the question, would our country be better off trying to build new and alternative schools of higher education? You have the University of Austin, which is of a different mold entirely, Hillsdale College. Is it better to try to move some of those very large gifts from places like Harvard and MIT and Cornell to build new institutions? You talked about putting new coursework in there and putting new avenues for discussion in there. Maybe we quit and go somewhere else? I don't know.
Go somewhere else too. Look, I love my kids to go to University of Austin. That I think it's an amazing project, and I think it sets the standard for some of these departments and other universities. But look, it's got to be done at scale. I mean, it takes a long time to build a university that gets accredited. University of Austin did it in record time. I think they did it in 2 years. They just got their accreditation. So that's amazing. So now kids can go and study there and graduate from the University of Austin with a degree. And I think I'll bet you they put out some of the smartest kids in the country. So I'm very bullish about them, but that doesn't solve the problem for hundreds of other thousands of students around the country, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, who want to get a traditional liberal arts education and not be indoctrinated in some ridiculous ideology.
So maybe one other thing that we need to be doing is moving our money from those that are overtly awful and really terrible, like Harvard. Some of the Harvard big donors have announced they will give no more money, but some of them are committed over the long term to endowments that they have set up, and there's a legal impediment to taking that money back. I do understand that they could try to sue to get their money back, but maybe we need to be moving things, encourage those people to take the money somewhere else.
Absolutely. Again, I go back to this idea of establishing academic programs within universities that exemplify these values. I still think that would be a great way for a billionaire hedge fund person who's invested heavily in these universities to use their money to reform their universities, because they're not going anywhere. And these universities have huge endowments, and they have plenty of money to sustain themselves. So you're not going to put them out of business by just withdrawing your annual giving from them. So I'd rather them try to reform these universities. I know a lot of people want to either, divest from universities, get their kids out of universities. I understand the sentiment. I'm not sure I would want my kids at some of those colleges right now, and I have kids that age. But I still think they're not going anywhere. We have to deal with the reality of higher education. And the reality of higher education is that there's hundreds of colleges that are problematic right now that we need to try to shift. And that's why I would urge them to try to invest within their colleges, but in a very different way than they have in the past.
And so we just got a question from a listener. So yesterday, 3 Ivy League college presidents went to Capitol Hill, and they said a lot of things, and most of them were really distressing, about how yelling from the river to the sea. I mean, they have, all of a sudden they want to do free speech. All of a sudden anything is free speech. Well, according to the Constitution, not everything is free speech, but okay. There was a lot of backlash to that. And this morning, the president of Harvard put out another statement. It wasn't a whole lot better than the first statement, but she kind of acknowledged she didn't say quite the right thing. Is that where she did it because she was pressured? There's no way she went to bed last night thinking, I did a great job on Capitol Hill, and she woke up this morning and said, no, I didn't do a great job on Capitol Hill. She was being responsive to the feedback she got. So yes. Is that a recommendation that people give that kind of feedback? I mean, I hope no one threatened her. I hope nobody was nasty. I hope everybody did it right. But she clearly was being responsive to something that she thought she needed to. Is that the place to put our
I think absolutely. Look, Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania basically called her, this is the University of Pennsylvania president. I think you might have been referring to her, unless there was a statement from Harvard that I missed. But he called it a disgrace. I believe he used the word disgrace, something close to disgrace. And that's a Democratic governor who said that. So I think that pressure clearly worked. I mean, this could be a game changer. The disgraceful testimony of these college presidents could be a game changer. This is the kind of scrutiny we need. So we need this to come from different directions. You need to be able to turn up the pressure on the public sphere. You need them to be accountable for the money that they've gotten from foreign universities. Again, all those can be done and have been done at the same time when they're giving testimony. Ask the tough questions, make them answer them, make them report. Make them own up to the money that they've received from universities, from these countries, and how these programs have become complete ideological cesspools. All of the above, multiple pressure points at once. There's no one way that's going to bring this change that we need. We're going to need to do it. It has to come from multiple directions at once. So I think the testimony was probably a watershed. But we've got to sustain that pressure over the long run. And it's not just pressure, and this is where I really want Jews to understand. It's not just pressure on how to treat Jews or how to talk about Israel. It goes much deeper. As long as we continue to inculcate our kids in this oppressor binary, this is going to continue. I want to show a 40-second video. Is that okay, Shoshana?
All right. See if we can do it. Go ahead.
Okay.
Some of the high schools that didn't walk out spent their lunches phone banking Congress. Over at the Columbia School of Social Work, students were holding a sit-in in solidarity with Palestine.
Yesterday, we held a 9-hour sit-in at the School of Social Work where we were threatened with sanctions. And today, we're here because it is part of the Shut It Down for Palestine movement that's happening all across the world today. And we are here because we are going to do a die-in. Currently, the School of Social Work uses a prop framework, which is power, race, oppression, and privilege, where we learn about decolonizing social work, which we think is hypocritical when we are being silenced on Palestine, which is a colonized place.
Okay, so you saw a video of a young woman who is talking about her program of social work at Columbia University, her master's program at social work. She's a anti-Israel activist. She's angry that the university, her social work program, is forbidding them from protesting in the school lounge and doing that die-in in the school lounge. Now, whenever I show that video to Jewish groups and I say, what did you see here? All they talk about is her anti-Israelism and her anti-Zionism and the die-in. But they didn't talk about the decolonizing social work agenda that was obvious in her remarks. She's saying, we've been taught to decolonize social work. Now, what the hell is decolonized social work? Decolonizing social work is this idea that social work, like every other discipline, is a white supremacist framework and is teaching its clients to reconcile themselves with our white supremacy society. And it's saying we have to teach our clients to rebel against the existing social work agenda. That's decolonizing social work. No one pays attention to that. That's what you all missed prior to October 7th. You were all obsessed with the anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitism. You were obsessed, and you didn't see these larger ideological trends. This is what you were. I'm going to show you, put a graphic up for a second. There's the iceberg metaphor, right? Where anti-Semitism is the tip of the iceberg, anti-Israelism, these are both above water. But below the iceberg are these larger academic trends that I've talked about. Postmodern theory, social justice ideology, cancel culture. These were beneath the surface of the water. These were beneath the surface. And that is what was producing the anti-Semitism and the anti-Israelism above the surface. And we pay too much attention to above the surface. We need to start fighting the larger ideological battle beneath the surface, or else we're going to continue to get everything that we've seen above the surface. That's the problem, in my view.
So I'm going to say this is why you are with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, because the real liberal values are free speech, free association, exchange of ideas, and no cancel culture. That's where you want us to go, right?
I do. And that's where I think that's the only bulwark against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campuses. Those values teach kids to how to think. They teach kids to be an open, free exchange of ideas. You're not going to end up with anti-Zionism if you're engaged in the free expression of ideas and you're able to argue different perspectives and the like. Anti-Zionism is the mindless idea. It's a mindless idea. And you come to it by being taught that the world is neatly divided, simplistically divided into oppressor and oppressed. That's how you come to it. And so we've got to teach kids how to think again if we expect them to reject anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
It argues for liberal values. We had a question come in. So you've looked primarily at the upper echelon, and you mentioned businesses also that have DEI people. Let's go lower. Here's a question about K through 12 schooling. Do kids in K through 12, it seems to me twofold. First of all, they're learning, I don't want to say bad things, they're learning things that are not helpful. And at the same time, we've taken civics education out of the classrooms. So something that might balance the left-wing culture has been removed. So the brakes are off. What's going on in the K through 12?
Yeah, that's the real tragedy. And again, we're missing the mark on this. We're all focused on college campuses, as we should be. But the potential damage that could be in K through 12 education is really scary right now. So after the George Floyd moment in 2020, California instituted something called ethnic studies that was in the university that I talked about that started 50-some years ago at San Francisco State University and spread. Those crazy professors are trying to get that same curriculum into K through 12 education, public school education around the United States. And they succeeded in California in getting a mandate for it. Now, California supposedly put in some guardrails that prevent the most extreme elements of this from being taught. So in other words, they shouldn't teach that Israel is a settler colonial state, but they're still teaching the ideology to California kids. And it is spreading. It is in Boston. It is in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is in Minneapolis. It is in Seattle. It is in Portland. It is in some schools in New York. And it is very scary. We're conditioning young people to see the world in precisely the same way that we've been conditioning college students and humanities to see the world. But we're dealing with a much, much bigger set of people than just kids who go to Brown. Now it's in every K through 12 school. So we've got to start pushing back and understand how potentially dangerous this is. This makes BDS look like child's play. This is a much more dangerous trend than BDS. So it's no accident that you saw in Oakland, California, a walkout of students who go and march through their own school and say, from the river to the sea. And it's no accident that you saw that high school in Queens, because this is starting to be inculcated. It starts in the teachers' colleges, by the way. It starts in the teachers' graduate programs. They're getting inculcated. It ends up in the teachers' unions. So the unions play a huge role as a vector of transmission of this ideology into the schools. And then they pressure their school systems to adopt this over the objections of parents who might be paying attention.
Okay, is civics education a necessary and sufficient, or necessary but not sufficient condition to help redress this?
I think civics education is absolutely critical, but I don't know if it's sufficient. First of all, a necessary condition is to stop the really egregious aspects of this curriculum from being taught. And then I think you have to have an aversion, and maybe this is integrated into a civics education, of sort of American pluralism, right? Of teaching about pluralism, because, we're a diverse country. We have different ethnicities, and we have to be able to do some justice to that. We have to satisfy the quench for teaching about the stories of different ethnic communities and how they came in this country and how they see this country. I think we can do that without this insane ideological overlay that these people are bringing into it. So I think the civic education that we teach should also include some understanding of what American pluralism is, as well as understandings of American democracy and how it works, and liberalism and government and everything else. I do think that that is sorely missing now, and would serve as a counterbalance and maybe even an alternative to this radicalism that we're seeing in schools today. So I would definitely push it.
So that seems like step one for K through 12. I mean, it's something parents can do, something parents should do. It also argues for beginning these things at the lowest possible level, which is your own school and then your own community of schools. When you go to the higher levels and you get to colleges, state universities might be, you might be able to have some influence on state universities because they're legislated and their money comes from the legislature. When you get to the colleges that are private, it seems to me that you have a more difficult time. So somebody has asked the question here, is it worth finding out whether the presidents of these institutions or some of the higher ups in these institutions have relations with organizations that they shouldn't? Are they getting money from bad places? Would exposing them help? Clearly, the president of Harvard, and by the way, the one that I saw was Harvard this morning, so there may be two of them that recant, but would exposing them, or as the questioner said to me, catching them with their pants down, is that a kind of pressure that can be helpful?
Sure. It has to come from multiple directions. Exposing their sources of funding, exposing what's taught in these schools, highlighting the extremism of some of the professors. You have professors of these colleges that put out horrific memes on social media that celebrated the hang gliders that came in and massacred Israeli kids in southern Israel. We've been looking at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and this department that they have there that is in bed with the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. It's a new institution trying to get something called critical Zionist studies in universities. Imagine what that looks like. A department or a center in universities expressly devoted to delegitimizing Zionism. That's what they're trying to do. Now, we've been able to fend them off in a lot of ways. We got NYU to cancel their appearance, and we're putting a lot of pressure on these universities not to go along with this. But it's frightening that these professors are actively pushing for that. So I think we have to expose those extremists in their ranks and make university presidents understand who they've hired, and make it so that their donors understand who they've hired, and their board of regents and their board of trustees.
Okay, now let's go a step higher. So we did K through 12, we do universities, so somebody has asked the question, where do you stand on eliminating the Department of Education? Is it part of the problem? Is it a way to affect change in a positive way, or do we just have to get rid of it?
I don't know if it makes structural sense to eliminate I mean, you look, the Department of Education is, I can give you examples of positives and negatives. On the positive front, there are several legal claims that the DOE is now entertaining of violations of Title VI against Jewish students on college campuses, that Jewish students are facing harassment, and DOE is the government arm that you go through. So that's happening now.
David, would you explain just briefly what Title VI is so that people know?
Yeah, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 creates a hostile environment standard that universities have been using. In other words, if universities are responsible for their own atmospheres, if those atmospheres become hostile to a specific protected minority group. So for example, if you're Black and you're in a pervasively hostile atmosphere toward Black people, then you can bring a legal claim against the university based on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Jews were long time excluded from it, but recently in the last several years are now included in Title VI and can launch complaints based on a hostile environment. And that does go through the university, it goes through the Department of Education. Then again, the Department of Education also provided a $3.2 million grant for one of those liberated ethnic studies groups at the University of California, Santa Barbara, that is teaching kids settler colonialism in the schools. So again, I think we've got to fight within the Department of Education, but I wouldn't necessarily advocate for its dismantling at this point. But I'm open to suggestions. It's just not something that's high on my priority list in terms of what we need to do.
Well, because it's also probably close to impossible. We're talking about eliminating a cabinet position of the United States government. It doesn't happen very often. So
No,
has it happened
sure
ever? I don't think it's ever happened. So, okay, so the fight is going to be in the trenches. It's going to be in the school districts. It's going to be in the universities. It's going to be finding allies, not necessarily Jewish allies, but finding free speech allies, finding pro-American allies, finding all kinds of other people with whom to deal. It seems like a huge, huge proposition. So we're sort of coming to the end of our program time here. And people that tune in know that I like to go out on a question, the answer to which is positive. I'm feeling slightly overwhelmed by this conversation, so I don't know if there's a positive out. But if I ask you, David, as you look forward at education in the United States, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you confused, as I am confused? Where are you, and where do you think we should be?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna say I'm optimistic in the sense that I believe America has the wherewithal to change itself. I think anything that can be made in 50 years, like the current problem, can be unmade in a shorter period of time. America is, if any country in the world can change itself, it's the United States. And so me being optimistic is me being optimistic in America and its future. And how can I not be? I love this country. I think its country is the greatest experiment in democracy in the history of the world. So how can we not be optimistic about America? This to me is the American challenge. It's reclaiming our institutions. It's reclaiming our dream, our American dream. And so I'm going to be optimistic. I think we have what it takes. I just think it's going to take a lot of sustained effort. And sometimes the stuff on the short term that we want to do that feels right may not be the right thing to do in the long term. And I think we have to come to terms with that. This is a long-term struggle. And I think we've got to fight it like a long-term struggle. It's not about getting a single university president to wave a magic wand. These are deep-seated, below the surface problems that we're going to have to fight and change over the long term. That means big investments in big programs and not just, getting the university president to say the right thing, tomorrow. So I think we've got to be in it for the long game.
So I'm happy that you ended up there. It allows me to go out on a high note, which, as we're getting ready to light our Hanukkah candles, is a good idea. Hanukkah is about hope. Hanukkah is about our future, our Jewish future. And I love the way you put that, our American future. This is all about who we are, what we love, where we live, and what we're going to do about it. David Bernstein, thank you very much for a great, scary, but also enlightening and positive conversation about our schools, our education, and our kids. Thank you and
Thank
happy
you very
Hanukkah.
much. Happy Hanukkah.